Welcome back. Now, next we're gonna introduce our panelists to the floor who will be talking more about Industry 4.0 and what it means to deploy an RTLS system during a pandemic. The panel will be hosted by our own Tom Ruth. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, and I'm Tom Ruth, Vice President of the Americas for Quuppa. And with me on today's panel discussion, I have Neil Salem, who is a dear friend and perhaps one of our most longest and oldest partners, as well as more prolific, I would say, partners in terms of understanding all the ins and outs of Quuppa. And Neil's the CEO of Nessa Solutions. And with me is Kevin Godinez. Kevin is our senior engineer who's focused on customer support and partner success. And today we're going to talk about deploying in a pandemic. We have an opportunity to describe a variety of circumstances that surround both technical as well as operational challenges that a customer has had. And I think one of the examples that we're going to use is the customer was a rather large food processing center, and we're going to describe some of the challenges that they had in getting an RTLS system to be operational, not only just to provide the location, but also to refine some of the rules engines and so forth that Nessa is so prolific at providing. So Neil, why don't you take a minute here and tell us a little bit about the environment for this particular customer, and identify the business challenge and some of the goals of what the customer was looking to see out of this deployment, and sort of the timeline, and perhaps a little bit on why you chose Quuppa to fulfill this particular opportunity.
Sure. Pleasure to be here, and thank you very much again. We received a call, I believe it was in May of last year, concerning a large food plant, 3-4 million square feet overall, that needed to provide the government some knowledge that they are actively doing contact tracing. And you receive a phone call saying, hey, when could you install it? Before even having any conversation of your infrastructure, on-site visits, the typical deployments that you usually do are understand what they want to achieve, understand their topology, go do a site visit, sit down with their stakeholders. All of those things didn't exist. And so what we ended up doing was pretty interesting, is we used FaceTime, and we walked their floor plan, and we understood from their stakeholders what they wanted to do, which was simply, they needed to provide the government knowledge, instantaneous information that they are providing a level of security and safety to their staff to be able to remain open. And because that they were in a state that was highly regulated by the government, we were not allowed to travel there. We were not allowed to do any on-site visits, obviously. And we were limited also on the time because they needed to have a deployment up in 2 to 3 weeks. So after our first call, maybe 30-40 minutes with a customer, they basically said, we have 400 employees that we need to know exactly where they are at any given stage. We did a FaceTime walkthrough of their facility. We asked for their as-built as a whole, and then we spoke to their IT team to understand the infrastructures that are capable to have. And what we learned from that was, one, it was a wet area. You needed to have enclosures. It was a lot of metal. It was high ceilings, but a lot of scaffolding and different areas as a whole. And it gave us a lot of visualization by doing a virtual walk, FaceTime virtual walk. So when we received the floor plans in 2D and in 3D, we really understood what could be done. So from that, we reached out to, we looked at the floor plans. We utilized the Quuppa positioning engine application to put the beacons where they needed to be. We sat and we spoke to Kevin, and we really, with visual references, We were able to really know where the beacons can and cannot go. We ended up using NEMA enclosures. And within a matter of 2-3 days from the time we received our floor plans, we had a topology built out. We utilized some level of the positioning testing that enabled us to know, how the system potentially could react. And also, to be honest with you, our knowledge of doing a lot of deployments in the past gave us some guidance on how to establish a good overlay of the beacons to enable us to do a lot of the workflows that we wanted to achieve.
Well, I mean, so that's a great overview, Neil. I mean, Kevin, you took a look at some of these floor plans and pictures and photos that Neil shared with you. What were some of the challenges as you saw it?
Well, I think not being physically on site, while a 2D floor plan is valuable, photos are valuable, they're all things we typically ask for when we're looking at planning a deployment. To not, it's difficult to spatially visualize that. So it definitely helps. We definitely want that. But the challenge is it's hard to determine depth and one thing's relation to another thing from a depth perspective and from a line of sight perspective. Because as you know, working off angle of arrival versus like RSSI, line of sight matters. While I can have photos and all that, I do have to be very aware of what's going to give me the best deployment scenario to allow me the most actual line of sight to a locator from any given position where a tag may be with that environment. So that can be challenging. Fortunately, as Neil said, we did a walkthrough, like a FaceTime walkthrough. That was certainly valuable. That was a bit of a good idea on the customer's part and on Neil's part. So those were probably the primary things I would say, because given that I have pictures, that picture is still a 2D representation. The floor plan's a 2D representation. Nothing really beats standing in the space and actually, looking around, but those things definitely help. The FaceTime video definitely helped.
Yeah, one of the things that we're seeing here as we come out of the pandemic is, as Neil said, you can't get on a plane and fly there. So you really have to, it challenges everyone to make sure that your communication of what's required gets transferred not just to the person that you're talking to, because they have to turn around and echo that then to other people on the floor who are going to be responsible for installing it. And obviously, we're going to have different areas of levels of understanding, I suppose. So, Neil, what other technologies did you consider for this in addition to Quuppa? I know that you work with a variety of different technologies, of different location technologies. What were your thoughts?
To be honest with you, in this deployment, we actually we only selected Quuppa. We didn't think of other technologies because they wouldn't enable us to do what they wanted to do. We wanted the client wanted to have, and we suggested to the client to have, is that we want to know all their positions. And so when we did the topology, we really did a lot of coverage, because not only did we want to do contact tracing, two rings within a distance, we wanted to do tag commands. If they got within a distance, the tags buzzed and they beeped and they lit up, as an example like that. We wanted to know where they were coming in from and going out of. And if you were going to do contact tracing, you need high accuracy. And the good part about this deployment was, you had good height, so you got a lot of coverage. Interesting enough, when we got there months later, there actually was scaffolding and multi-layers, which the FaceTime did not provide us any of that information whatsoever. And we actually saw how people walked upstairs on a 2D, and it was actually pretty accurate in the location. So we were very happy with the accuracy of it. I think at the end of the day, if you look at accuracy to do contact tracing, there's two different technologies that enable us to do it for precision data. But the way that we want to deploy this platform, because when we do our deployments with our customers, we really want to explain to them, don't do this just for contact tracing. You're going to do a deployment, you're going to use the infrastructure for a lot of other things. And so, you want to give them an idea of what they can do with location, because the value of location was huge for them. There was a lot of lessons learned that they changed the way that they do their work from this. So you know, we've been working with Quuppa since I think we're one of the original 6, you know, partners. You know, it enabled us. We had to do this in a NEMA enclosure. It was a room that had to be sprayed down every single day. We are very comfortable with the Quuppa. You know, Quuppa is really an enterprise application. We have the confidence that it's not going to go down. We work with the IT team during the deployment, you know, selecting the proper ports, the proper security protocols. You know, this is something that you have to do and think about the technology that you're going to use. And to be honest with you, Quuppa was the only one for this infrastructure and instance that we were very confident and comfortable with.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned something there very quickly about contact tracing with the haptic notification that allows the individual to self-correct. What other do more with location as being a big mantra of Quuppa? What other things do you envision for that particular environment as the next step?
So we actually did the next steps already. We deployed it in the cafeteria and into the zone where they go into the food processing area. And in the zone in the food processing area, just before that, they have a cleanliness area that they had to basically go and clean hands. Mm-hmm. And so they wanted to monitor how long people were going into the areas or the zones. They want to make sure that they go through the proper pathway. You know, the problem with location is if you don't have good accuracy or good deployments, you get gaps. And then your data shows gaps and the data doesn't report out properly. So what we are doing now with them is that we're going to be deploying across all of their infrastructure and their different buildings as a whole and utilizing the Quuppa platform. But they saw, you know, every second where people were. They saw that they went through the cleanliness areas, how long they waited or stayed inside the cleanliness areas, because they have protocols that they have to wash their hands for 30 seconds or 45 seconds as an example. But if somebody just walked right through, you could actually know that they did not do the proper performance that they needed to. So there's a lot of workflows, you know, time and attendance, you know, location, security, cleanliness, you know. But contact tracing, what's cool about it is that the way that we built our applications very different than a lot of other people. We really try to live from a back end perspective. So if 2 people were within a zone, we actually measured the distance of how far they were at the closest point, the duration of it, so that when we were provided the reporting data, they saw that, you know, tag A saw tag B for 14 times. Of the 14 times, they were, you know, one time they were there together for 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds in that perspective. But because we were able to use the back channel data to the tag, we were able to, within a second, to send a tag command to the buzz on it. And we were able to use one of your tag vendors that were able to adjust the vibration, because what was interesting is in food service, they wear jackets and they wear sweaters. And you would think that that the buzz would go right through, but it wouldn't. So we were able to adjust the buzz and data from that perspective. And the funny thing is that when we did our on-site visit and I walked through the whole area, I got the dirtiest look by one of the food service employees because their tag buzzed. And what we found out is that they didn't want their tag to ever buzz. So it was almost like gamifying, you know, a solution, a lesson learned that we had from that perspective.
Well, jumping forward into one of the other questions I had in terms of, you know, user adoption or end user adoption, since we're getting into the human factor side of things. I mean, how you mentioned the gamification. Was there any hesitancy on the part of the workers, you know, in terms of being tracked or traced? Were there any issues in that regard that you had to deal with?
So, you know, it's funny, in healthcare, that was a problem that we had years ago, is, you know, putting tags on staff and doctors and nurses, and nobody wants to know where somebody is. But if you enable them and you educate them on how the value of the data that they're providing, you know, where is the doctor, where is the patient, where is the nurse, and you're showing them, hey, you know, this is the closest point to a device from you, they, within days, acknowledge the value. So when you do any deployment, you gotta not come from a top-down level. You gotta really come from a middle level and say, okay, here's what we're gonna provide you. Because of COVID, what we are actually providing is safety and security to the staff. And they were very much engaged in that perspective. And the funny thing is that when they want to stop the pilot after 90 days, the staff said, no, we're very comfortable wearing it. We want to wear it. And it's still ongoing to this day, where we're tracking several hundred of their employees at any given point. So it's all the way that you go about doing a deployment. The deployment is not get me a map, put up hardware, turn it on the system. 90% of those deployments will fail. You've got to go and you got to work with the right people. You got to get the buy-in by the different people, and including the people that are the workers that are wearing the tags as a whole. And then you got to educate them on what they're doing in that perspective. The other thing that we used in that deployment was a panic button, where you were able to touch the button if there was an alarm in that perspective. And it was triggered several times, and there was some issues, and they were able to get reaction instantaneously. So if you look at these large facilities, their management or their people above, their supervisors, are in offices very far away, and they were able to react almost instantaneously to that and push the data to the right people, to the floor, the floor people, the floor service people. And the other thing that we saw was out of lessons, we always had 2 or 3 tags that had the biggest level of contact tracing. What we ended up finding out is those were the supervisors that were walking the floor. And the leadership started looking at the supervisor to look at the metrics of how much they actually walked the floor. So a lot of things that we never thought, because we're like, hey, tag 7, tag 11, and tag 14 are the biggest users by a lot. They were able to see it, but they actually promoted somebody to a higher level because they were the most embedded and invested manager. So that data translated to the value. So it's how you sell, in my opinion.
That's fascinating. I love hearing about these different use cases and the surprises, the happy surprises of what people realize from a deployment that they didn't originally expect. And I think in some of the other panel discussions, we talked about some of those examples. From the ROI perspective, did they realize that there were some productivity benefits by either having the workers understand that they were being tracked, or that allow them to focus a little bit more on their jobs, or was that a byproduct of social distancing?
Yeah, the biggest thing was that the way that their deployment was set up was that they all used to work side by side in these conveyor belts. And their productivity was based on the speed of the conveyor belt at speed, and how much they're turning, right? So it's inventory, it's turning.
Yeah, sort of like the I Love Lucy.
Yeah, basically in that perspective. Well, what happened was that they all communicate and talk a lot with each other. And when they were spaced out, because if they got close within each other, they buzzed, they ended up having to respect the spaces in that area. We also built geofences on the floor where they were supposed to be positioned. So we actually know that they were in their zone for how long they were in that zone for. Their productivity went up, I think, around 30%, which was a byproduct of not communicating as much. And also that they were able to focus on their work. These are the things that Nessa and I'm assuming Quuppa have no clue the outcome of the value of the dot on the map. We have a reporting engine that provides data where something was at every given second, at every given time, in the location of what it is. And then from that, we were able to build some visualization reporting to sort of give, worst offenders, best users, and so forth like that. And they ended up looking at that dashboard, and their management looked at a dashboard on a weekly basis. But they correlated the fact that they were able to, work more productive. And then the managers and supervisors really walking the floor and saw that data. And so, is COVID over? No. Is it important in food service to be healthy? Absolutely. But I think the byproduct that came out of this was really that they were much more efficient by working in zones. And that's why it's still ongoing and still active, and they're going to be utilizing it for a lot of other things. So you learn byproduct value data from the fact that this is where the dot is on the map. Again, something that we would never know because that wasn't the industry we were in.
Yeah, fascinating. I love hearing those stories because, as I always so callously say, we put the dot on the map, but it's meaningless without your context and your business rules engine. I'd like to go back to one of the things that you touched on at the beginning, in terms of the deployment of, you couldn't get on planes. And one of the things that has happened here in the collaboration with Kevin, as an example, is something that we encourage a lot of our newer partners to do with some of their more sophisticated projects, especially with industry where there's a lot of metal. And so, Kevin, take us through the process a little bit of what you look for and what you ask everybody for whenever you can't be there on site to help guide them. What do you tell the partners to send you?
Oh, sure, Tom. And as we mentioned before, the floor plan, the videos, photographs. I want to understand the use cases, how the people might interact, and if there's a travel component, like they're going from this place to this place, what are their typical transit routes between those places? Is there a place where they might bottleneck or congregate? Like we say in the RF world, a person's just a big bag of water. RF doesn't like water, right? Or steel. Those are probably the two most detrimental things within an environment. So we had both of those, right? We had people in tight areas because they were on a conveyor, in between conveyor belts. So we had metal, bags of water, metal in the overhead, and all of that. So I think, those are the kind of things we want to understand. How you want to track, what you want to track, how it relates to the environment. And that open communication between myself and the partner is very important. I try to anticipate what I think they need and the questions I need to ask, but the more they understand us and our technology, Quuppa and its technology, the more they're able to sort of be aware of things that I may not be aware of and bring that to me and question me in that regard. And I think to Nessa's case and to Neil's case, in this specific case, I've worked quite a bit with Neil and his team. We already had a very collaborative relationship. So that allowed, a really free flow of information. And another thing we do is once the project's been deployed, we might ask to share that with us, and I might take that back to our team to address any potential challenges. Because I've got my experience, but we always like to bring as much experience as we can to bear on a project, especially if we're facing, challenges that might require somebody else's input.
I remember there was some metal here as well as some stairs and two different levels in this particular situation. Did that cause any challenges for us?
Well, Neil will shake his head no, and for the most part it didn't, but it was an unexpected occurrence, as Neil mentioned earlier, right? We weren't aware that it was a transition. And for anybody familiar with our technology, we typically define a tracking plane. So when we're moving along that tracking plane, it can cause the dot to be positioned somewhere within a realm of where it is, but not as precise as we might typically expect. But in this environment, it was more of a partial transition. It wasn't like a full floor or anything like that. So it didn't have much of an impact, and we were able to roll with that, so to speak, in the project, and it didn't cause us any glitches or anything like that. But that goes back to, in the photos, that transition wasn't, didn't jump out at you, or in the videos, and certainly not in the floor plan. So that's where being on site, you can't really beat that, but we did the best that we could. And fortunately, it worked out for us in that one area. But yeah,
technology was up. I mean, Neil, how did you guys know that this was done correctly? Since you weren't the ones putting it up there, you weren't the ones with the level, you didn't do the measurement. You had to trust that this was being done correctly and that the floor plans were accurate. In many cases, we always find that floor plans aren't always exactly the same as the physical space itself. How did you know that this was done? Tell us a little bit about your validation process.
So I think there's a few things to just go sort of backwards, right?
Okay.
Because we're one of the original partners with you guys, we went through the pain of doing deployments, as all of us were new to this. And one of our deployments was 3.5 million square feet and thousands of beacons. and you learn a lot on how you do it. You learn a lot about where tags should be positioned. That Z-plane is a huge factor. You know, one of the things that we learned back in the day is if you have a 3 meter, 4 meter ceiling, your conical space is usually 3 times the height of the space. But if you're 6 feet tall and your tag is at 5'8", your conical space is cut by a substantial amount. So, you know, as Quuppa has grown, they've sort of spoken to a lot of the partners like us that have gone through, as we call it, the pain of doing the deployments. So at this point, to be honest with you, we're at the point on our team where we could eye it, literally look at it and say, this is where you're going to need it, and this is where you're going to have gaps. And when you're dealing with stairs, as an example, you're not going to have a dot stay in line. You're going to have a dot go to the angle because your Z-plane changes. Therefore, you know where the dot's going to go. And that's why, so when we saw the stairs, we saw the angle going up, and it was gradual in that perspective. And we said there's stairs there. So you could see things from that perspective. Knowledge is about experience. And especially in deployments like this, listen, we'll call up, you know, Kevin and say, what do you think? We know where things will work. We know where issues will occur. We know that TV screens are mirrors. We know that, you know, glass causes reflection. But our application has a lot of filters that do it. Your job, Quuppa's job, is to provide us the best dot. Our job is to provide the value to the dot, as we all say. But there's a middle, and that middle is working together as a whole. So how did we do the deployment? Well, we know all the steps, right? We know that you need to have the floor plan. And guess what? The floor plan wasn't right. And we basically sent them out a laser measure and said, laser measure everything. Good, we got now a center. Measure the height, we got the right height. And what we ended up finding out was that it was a floating floor. And a floating floor does cause issues. And where they would place the tags and so forth like that. But the way that we did deployment is that we pretty much figured out we would need around, I think, 2-3 dozen beacons deployed in a star topology, which enabled us to get, you know, outside in and throughout the whole perspective, so we could get good accuracy. We always add a few extra, because at the end of the day, you don't want to overpopulate it, but you want to have enough data so that you're able to get less float in any of the technology in this perspective. So what we did is we packaged everything in a box. We named every single locator. We had all of the IP addresses, MAC addresses there. We sent them a computer with the QPE already built in, with the cable and battery pack, so that they could run and do a remote. And when we shipped them everything based on our floor plans, we told them where everything needs to go. We work with the IT to make sure that all the ports, DHCP was back to the proper ports, that we were able to receive the data. And shockingly, we did the deployment within 3 days from them receiving the hardware, doing the installation, because they had to do the installation at midnight till 5 in the morning, because we don't want to shut down their plant. That costs them money. So we were there to support them late at night or early in the morning. Then the next day, once the installation was done, we started doing the configuration. We educated them on how to do the 2 positioning points in that perspective. You know, it's not a hard system once you sort of understand how to do it. We work with them. We got them down to 0.001, which was awesome in that perspective. And then once we had that on, we spent around 2 days testing the system on if there was any flow. And we did have a certain area that we had some issues, and we ended up finding out that the beacon was actually tilted. And that was based on Kevin and I having a conversation saying, this doesn't make sense. So I guess knowledge and experience trump sometimes what a computer should say. And we had that up and running in 3 days. Kevin was accessible to us, instantaneously. Again, we have a good relationship. They'll call us if they have a question. We'll call them if they have a question. We should use your knowledge. We don't know everything. We just know what we know in that perspective. And we use some hardened lines. We use in our application, geofenced areas so that the tag doesn't jump. So we'll sit in that perspective. And they were live after 2 days of testing. They were live. So from the time that the box got there to the time that they were up and live, never being there, we were 5 days, and that was awesome.
Yeah, that is up.
I would add that the part that I was concerned about from an SE perspective is the focusing / calibration of the locators, because that is helpful if you've experienced that. And so that, I think, going in, Neil, I would say that was one of the things we were most concerned about from a technology standpoint, is walking them through the focusing and the calibration of the locators, because that is a very precise thing. Garbage in, garbage out, I like to say. If you get that wrong, then what you can expect to get out of that is going to be wrong as well. And I think that all came together really well, because as Neil said, it wasn't a time-consuming process. They sort of picked it up. Neil and his team walked them through that. We came out the other side of that with that one locator that was slightly elevated, which that's going to happen. That's one of the things, as Neil said, we talked about, and I'm like, check that. So yeah, it was overall that went extremely well.
And to add to that, so when you send it, you don't want them to do it by hand, so we send them a tripod. We walk them through how to do the positioning. We place, we send them a laser measure. We send them the box with all of the tools. But we also were remotely in via one of the applications. So as they were going, we were actually seeing everything. So yeah, they would go under, we would do it. So we really did a remote deployment. And what it enabled us to do is that we could do this anywhere. We could, go in, as long as we have a proper, methodology, a proper documentation, which we do. This is step 1, this is step 2. Don't go to step 3. You got to go through the steps in that perspective. Yep. The one thing that we did find that was really interesting is 2 of the beacons out of, I think, the 2 or 3 dozen that were installed were on AC units, and they were vibrating at a constant, and it did not affect the location data. So there was some things that you would not see on how it was deployed, and we did do these deployments in a NEMA box. So the beacon actually was installed inside of a NEMA enclosure and it did not lose any of the signal. And that was actually Kevin. Yeah, Kevin provided us that. Yeah, so the locator was inside of a box enclosed, and Kevin provided us information of where to get the right one, and that was easy. And so to that point, I'd like to mention real quick, if you're going to do that, make sure it's an all plastic box. Yes.
You don't want a metal NEMA box.
No.
So, but yeah, that environment did require that. So it was a strong collaboration. The good thing on the front end was Neil and discussing with us. Neil's team did a great job of planning this, talking through potential issues and being aware of that, and giving the customer all the tools they needed to succeed. And that came with a high level of planning on the front end, so we didn't have to deal with oops on the back end. And that's vital to any project, whether you can't go on site or you can. The more you plan and are prepared on the front end, the easier it's going to go on the back end.
Yeah, strong. I mean, it may sound rudimentary or fundamental with any technology that you're working with. And most of the people who work with us are technology professionals and have been around the block. You'd think that they would know that, but we still find people trying to take shortcuts. And I think what Neil has described here is a great example of just making it very simple, knowing oftentimes that the person that's going to be doing the work may not be the one that's receiving the instruction from you remotely like this. So great work, Neil and Kevin, and you guys made my job so easy here. I'm going to wrap that up and say back to mission control. And thank you for my panelists for such a great and engaging conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, guys.